The divorce settlement took 11 minutes to read and 22 years to earn. Margaret Collier sat in the parking lot of the Harlan County Courthouse on a gray October afternoon and did not go inside immediately. She sat in her 2009 Honda Pilot, both hands on the steering wheel, engine off, and looked at the building through the windshield, the way you look at something you have been dreading for so long that the actual arrival of it feels almost anticlimactic. Inside that building, a judge she had never met was about to divide her life into columns. She had known this was coming for 8 months. She had prepared for it, and had sat across from her attorney a dozen times and gone over every number, every asset. She was prepared. She went inside. 40 minutes later, she walked back out into the cold, with her copy of the settlement agreement folded in her coat pocket, and the specific, hollow silence of a woman who has just watched everything she built get handed to someone who broke it. Daniel had taken the house, the real house. The 4-bedroom on Alderman Street with the porch swing Margaret had picked out herself, and the backyard garden she had planted every spring for 16 years. He had taken the joint savings account, which had held $41,000 when she filed, and $2,200 by the time his lawyers were finished explaining where it had gone. He had taken the car that worked, and left her the one that didn't, entirely. In winter, he had taken the years, not legally. No judge could award those, but practically, functionally. In every way that mattered, Margaret had stopped working when their daughter Sophie was born, because Daniel had asked her to, and she had loved him enough to say yes. And now Sophie was 8 years old, and Margaret was 43, and her resume had a decade-long gap in it that no cover letter had yet found a way to make sound like anything other than what it was. She had $900 in a checking account. She had Sophie, who was currently at her sister Ruth's house, eating after-school crackers and watching cartoons, and not yet knowing that the world she had grown up in was permanently behind her. And she had 37 days before Ruth's landlord raised the rent, and Ruth's husband began running out of patience in the quiet and careful way of men who had never wanted to say anything unkind and were getting very close to having to. Margaret drove to Ruth's house. She helped Sophie with her homework. She made dinner. She waited until Sophie was asleep, and then she sat at Ruth's kitchen table with her laptop open and looked, with the focused and slightly desperate discipline of someone studying for an exam they could not afford to fail, at property listings in Harlan County. It was almost midnight when she found it. The listing was buried on the 3rd page of a county tax auction site, poorly formatted, photographed in what appeared to be failing afternoon light. A single image showed the front of a 2-story wood-framed house, wide and deeply overgrown, the kind of structure that looked less like a building and more like the land had grown tired of waiting and begun quietly taking it back. The left side of the porch had collapsed. The windows were dark with decades of grime. Above the front door, which was painted a deep weathered red, a transom window caught the last of the light in the photograph and threw it back in a dull amber gleam. That made the whole thing look, despite itself, like it was still alive. County Tax Auction 7 Sycamore Hollow Road, approx 1,800 square feet, 4.2 acres, condition unknown, as is opening bid, $900. Margaret stared at the screen. $900 was everything she had. It was Sophie's emergency fund and her own, and the only distance between them and a conversation she did not know how to have with her 8-year-old about what came next. Spending it on a collapsed house in a hollow she had never heard of was not a rational decision. A rational person did not do this. A careful, reasonable, patient person looked at this listing and kept scrolling. Margaret had been careful and reasonable and patient for 22 years. She knew exactly where that had gotten her. She placed the bid at 11:52 p.m. By 8 a.m. the next morning, she had won. Sycamore Hollow Road did not appear on any map she could find. She located it eventually on a county survey document downloaded from the assessor's website. A thin, unpaved line branching off Route 119 about 5 miles past the edge of Clover, running south into a section the survey simply marked unincorporated. She drove out the following morning with Sophie in school and Ruth thinking she had a job interview, her phone propped on the cracked dashboard, displaying the hand-plotted coordinates. The road was barely a road, and two clay tire tracks separated by a ridge of frost-killed grass, canopied by bare November branches that filtered the grey light into something thin and pale. Margaret drove slowly, the Honda shuddering over frozen ruts, until the tree line broke and the house appeared in a clearing at the end of a path that had once been gravel and was now mostly memory. It was larger than the photograph had suggested. She stood outside it for a long moment with her hands in her coat pockets, breath showing in the cold air, looking at the wide front steps and the weathered red door and the transom window catching the flat winter light exactly as it had in the listing photograph. She had spent every dollar she owned on this. There was no version of today in which she drove back down that clay road and pretended she hadn't. Margaret Collier walked forward, and the front door was unlocked. The smell reached her. Before her eyes adjusted to the dark, not rot, not the black chemical sharpness of mold and standing water that she had braced herself for on the drive out. This was something older and drier. Wood smoke pressed so deeply into the walls over so many decades, it had become part of the material itself. Dried lavender underneath that, faint but unmistakable, and beneath everything, the particular dusty sweetness of old paper, the smell of a place that had been intensely lived in and had been holding its breath ever since. She stepped inside. The foyer opened up wider than she expected, with a ceiling that climbed a full 12 feet overhead and a staircase on the right side that swept upward in a broad, unhurried curve before disappearing into the dark of the second floor. The banister was intact, dark walnut, smooth and unbroken, with carved newel posts at the base that had no business being in a $900 tax auction property. She ran her hand along the wood. Not a crack, not a soft spot. The floors beneath her feet were wide plank oak buried under years of leaf debris and grit. But when she crouched and pressed her palm flat against the surface, she could feel the density of it, sound and dry and completely, stubbornly intact. She stood slowly and looked around. The wallpaper was a deep forest green with a pattern of faded gold medallions, peeling at the upper seams but backed by plaster that was smooth and uncracked behind it. She pressed her knuckle against the wall in 3 places, hallowed every time, no hollow sound. No soft give of water damage working behind the surface. This house was not what the listing had suggested. The listing had suggested a teardown. What Margaret was standing in was a structure that had been built by someone who intended it to outlast them by a significant margin, and had succeeded. She moved into the front room. The fireplace dominated the far wall, massive, built from local fieldstone, mortared by hands that had known exactly what they were doing. The mantelpiece was a single slab of hand-hewn timber, 8 inches thick. On it sat 3 objects undisturbed by the years: a brass oil lamp with the globe still intact, a woman's work glove stiff with age, and a small framed photograph. Lying face down in the dust, Margaret crossed the room and picked up the photograph. She turned it over, sepia-toned, mounted on thick cardstock in the style of the early 20th century. A woman standing in front of this house, recognizable by the transom window above the red door, wearing a dark, high-collared dress, her hair pinned up, her expression carrying the particular gravity of someone who had been asked to hold still long enough for the truth of their face to come through. She appeared to be in her 50s. She was tall and completely upright, and she looked directly into the camera with an expression that was not stern, but was entirely without apology, on the back in a careful copperplate hand. 3 words: "This is mine." Margaret set the photograph back on the mantelpiece, propped upright this time. She spent the next 90 minutes moving through the house methodically, the way you move through something you are trying to understand, rather than simply see. Every room on the ground floor she entered and stood in long enough to take it fully before moving on. The dining room with its long oak tables still in place. Surface thick with dust, but the wood beneath unwarped and true. The kitchen retrofitted sometime in the 1960s, but built on bones that were much older. a deep farmhouse sink wide and heavy, and a wood-burning range still standing beside the newer gas stove someone had added decades ago, a pantry off the kitchen with glass mason jars still lined on the shelves, sealed with wax, and their contents reduced by time to dark solids that no longer identified themselves, and, at the far end of the ground floor hallway, a door closed, and not just closed, locked, with a heavy mortise lock and a keyhole larger than any she had seen in a residential house. She tried the handle twice. It did not move. She pressed her palm flat against the door and felt nothing. No vibration, no temperature difference. Then she pressed her ear to the wood, and she heard it, not a voice, not an animal. A sound that was low and rhythmic and mechanical, coming from somewhere on the other side of the door with the steady, unhurried patience of something that had been going for a very long time, and intended to continue, a ticking, deep and resonant and slow, like the house itself had a pulse, and had never stopped keeping time through all the years of emptiness and silence and waiting. Margaret stepped back from the door. She stood in the dim hallway with dust motes, turning slowly in the grey light from the far window, and felt something move through her that she did not immediately have a name for. Not hope. Hope was too fragile, too dependent on outcomes she could not yet see. Something older than hope, something that did not require the future's cooperation in order to exist in the present. She was still standing there when she heard the car. It came up the clay tracks slowly, the careful, deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where the ruts were. Margaret went to the kitchen window and looked through the grime-hazed glass. A dark green Cadillac, old but immaculate, pulled into the clearing and stopped. The engine went quiet. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was elderly, 75 at least, perhaps older, with close-cut white hair and a long wool overcoat that reached nearly to his ankles. He carried a leather briefcase worn through at the corners to a lighter shade. He stood beside the car and looked at the house for a moment with an expression Margaret could not read through the dirty glass. Then he looked directly at the kitchen window, directly at her. He did not appear surprised. He reached into the car, retrieved a dark felt fedora, settled it onto his head with the deliberate care of a familiar ritual, and walked toward the front door. Margaret met him on the porch. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at her. His eyes under heavy white brows were a pale, clear grey, steady and unhurried. "Mrs. Collier," he said, "my name is Edmund Hale. I was the estate attorney for a woman named Dorothea Vance." He paused, just briefly. "I have been coming to this house every November for 11 years, waiting for someone to open that door." Margaret looked at him. "I don't know anyone named Dorothea Vance," she said. Edmund Hale held her gaze with the expression of a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time and could finally see the person he had been carrying it for. "No," he said quietly. "But she knew you were coming." Edmund Hale sat at the long dining room table with his briefcase open in front of him and spoke the way men speak when they have been waiting a very long time to say something and want to say it correctly. Margaret sat across from him with her coat still on. "Dorothea Vance was born in this house in 1924, Edmund began. "She was the only child of Robert and Clara Vance, who built this structure on land the family had held since before the First World War. Dorothea lived here her entire life. She taught school in Harlan County for 30 years, and when she retired she came back to this house and stayed until she died." He paused. 11 years ago, in January, in a chair beside that fireplace, she was 89 years old. He straightened a document on the table with 2 careful fingers. She had no children, no surviving relatives of any kind. Under ordinary circumstances, a person who dies without heirs sees their property absorbed by the state. The county auctions it, a beat. That is the end of them. He looked up. Dorothea did not intend to be ended that way. "She left a will," Margaret said. "She left a very specific will," Edmund said, "constructed over many years with considerable care. She instructed me to hold the property in trust and to allow it to reach tax auction under one condition." He paused. "That the opening bid be set at exactly $900. Margaret's breath caught. She also instructed me that the will could only be executed in favor of a woman who came to this property alone. Not a developer, not a representative, a woman alone. He met her eyes. Those were her exact words, and she was not a woman who used words loosely. The dining room held its silence around them. She didn't know me, Margaret said. She did not know your name, Edmund agreed. She knew the circumstance. She knew the kind of woman who would spend her last dollar on an abandoned house in a hollow that appears on no map. A pause. She knew what that decision meant. About a person. He reached into his briefcase and produced an envelope. Aged and sealed, her name absent from it. Addressed simply in Dorothea's copperplate to the woman who opens the door. She also left you a key. He set it on the table between them, iron, long-shanked, heavy. Built for a lock meant to last not years, but lifetimes. She asked that you open the locked room yourself, Edmund said. She was specific about that, too. The key turned on the first attempt, the door swung inward without resistance, as though it had simply been waiting for the right hand and had no interest in being difficult about it. Now that it had arrived, Margaret reached inside the frame and found the light switch by instinct, and the single overhead bulb flickered twice and held, casting a warm, steady light across a room. That stopped her in the doorway. It was a study, flue-to-sailing shelves on 3 walls, built from the same dark walnut as the staircase banister, filled from base to top with ledgers, document cases, and file boxes, each one labeled in Dorothea's careful copperplate hand. In the center sat a partner's desk, wide and clear-surfaced, with a green glass lamp, and on the left side of the blotter, the source of the ticking she had heard through the door, a brass mantel clock. 8 inches tall, still running after 11 years of solitude, with the patient indifference of something built before people stopped building things to last. On the right side of the blotter, centered precisely, was an envelope, the woman who opens the door. Margaret sat in the desk chair, leather, cracked with age, solid as the day it was made, and opened the letter. "I do not know your name," it began, "but I know something true about you. I know that you arrived here with very little, and that someone spent a significant portion of your life convincing you that very little was what you deserved. I know this because the woman who bids her last dollar on an abandoned house is not a foolish woman. She is a woman who has been failed. By the law, by marriage, by the institutions that were built to protect her, and chose instead to protect the people who had more to offer them. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it because I was that woman once, and I did not have what I am about to give you. And I have spent 30 years making certain that someone eventually would. This house is yours. The land it sits on is yours. That is the smallest part of what I am leaving you. In 1961, I discovered that the Harlan County Land Survey of 1929, the survey that established property boundaries for nearly half the private land in this county, contained a deliberate falsification. The eastern boundary of this property, as recorded in the original Vance deed, extends 1,000 feet further than the 1929 survey acknowledged. The falsification was not accidental. It was commissioned. The men who commissioned it are dead. The company that benefited from it is not. Margaret's hands began to shake. She kept reading. That company is the Harlan County Development Corporation. They are currently constructing a mixed-use development, retail, residential, a hotel on land that by the original deed belongs to this estate, a pause which now belongs to Wau. The documentation establishing this is complete and has been verified by 2 independent surveyors whose affidavits are in the red ledgers on the 3rd shelf, left side. I spent 30 years making the documentation complete because I understood that sentiment is useless against an institution, and only evidence survives. They built on ground that was never legally theirs. Edmund will explain what that means in practical terms. I will tell you only what it means in human terms. They took something that did not belong to them, and they built their proudest achievement on top of it. And the foundation they are so certain of is sitting on land that has been waiting 60 years to come home. A beat. Foundations matter. You may remind them of that. The clock on the desk belonged to my mother. It has not stopped since she wound it last. I would like you to keep it running. Dorothea Vance Margaret set the letter down. She sat for a moment in the old leather chair with the brass clock ticking beside her. And 30 years of one woman's patient, meticulous, undefeated work arranged on the shelves around her, like something that had always been hers, and had simply been waiting for her to arrive and claim it. Then she picked up her phone and called Edmund Hale into the room. He came without being asked twice. He set his briefcase on the edge of the desk and began laying out documents with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been waiting 11 years for this exact moment, and was now going to waste a second of it, now that it had come. The development project, Edmund said, placing a survey map in front of her, broke ground 3 years ago. They are 60% through construction. He paused. The entire eastern parcel, the hotel, the residential block, and the primary retail structure sits within the disputed boundary. He set his finger on the map. All of it. Margaret looked at the map. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the letter in her hand. How much, she said carefully, have they spent building on land that isn't theirs? Edmund's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A quiet, long-held satisfaction finally permitted to surface. Enough, he said. That they will settle before this reaches a courtroom. He was right. The legal process took 6 months. The land rights attorney Edmund, retained in Lexington, described Dorothea's documentation as the most thoroughly prepared private land claim he had encountered in 30 years of practice. The Harlan County Development Corporation's legal team requested 3 continuances. They did not get a 4th. They settled on a Tuesday morning in April, in a conference room Margaret had driven 4 hours to sit in. And when the number was placed in front of her, she did not react visibly, because she had learned, in the past 6 months, that the people across the table were watching her face for information. And she had stopped giving it to them for free. She called Ruth from the parking garage afterward. She did not call Daniel. He heard about it the way people in small counties hear about things, through the particular, efficient network of people who had always privately suspected he was exactly what he had turned out to be. He called her once. On a Sunday evening in May, she watched his name on the screen until it stopped. She was sitting at Dorothea's desk when he called. Sophie was upstairs. The fire in the front room was going. And outside the window, the Sycamore Hollow clearing was green and deep in the full arrival of spring. The kudzu cut back, and the gravel path restored, and the red front door repainted. The same color it had always been, the same deliberate, unapologetic red. The brass clock ticked on the windowsill. Margaret turned the page. There is a particular kind of woman who gets handed nothing and builds everything anyway. Not because the world made space for her, but because she stopped waiting for the world's permission and walked through a door that had been unlocked the entire time, waiting for someone stubborn enough and desperate enough and finally free enough to simply turn the handle and step inside. Dorothea Vance had known she was coming. She had just been patient enough to wait.